This month, two panels of doctors appointed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis voted to ban gender-affirming care for people under 18 in the state. The new rules will only apply to new patients. People already receiving gender-affirming care should not be impacted. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, Republicans introduced a measure proposing a similar ban, saying it is the legislature's responsibility to, quote, protect the health and welfare of minors.
The measure will be one of the first pieces of legislation taken up in Tennessee in 2023. Activists are calling the move an attack on the LGBTQ community.
There are procedures already in place that make sure that the type of haymaking that people are making around this type of care are well protected against. So I don't see it as the issue that people are trying to make it an issue of.
Joining us now to weigh in on this is Cattinson, a detransitioned woman who testified at several of the medical board hearings in Florida. Cat, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're really glad to have this discussion with you. Why don't you talk about, what your objection to or support for prohibiting gender-affirming care is, and maybe share, your personal story or stake in this.
Sure. So first of all, the phrase gender-affirming care is very misleading. What the affirmation model entails, which is what I experienced and what a lot of detransitioners who testified also experienced, is that rather than when they go to the doctor asking for help with their gender dysphoria, it's not comprehensive care. Instead, they are affirmed as the opposite sex and put on a conveyor belt towards puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries. So this bill in Florida, or this measure in Florida rather, was about minors receiving gender-affirming care. And for them, it's particularly dangerous because children cannot consent to making irreversible changes to their body. And also the science, the Florida board ultimately decided to ban gender-affirming care for under 18 because they reviewed the science and it is in fact experimental. Just because puberty blockers have been used for other conditions does not mean they're then safe to use for gender dysphoria. There's never been anything like clinical trials on this. And there's a lot of risks like osteoporosis, stunted brain development, infertility as well.
Kat, am I right to understand that your transition story happened much later in life when you were about 28 years old?
Yes and no. So I started to identify as transgender when I was 13, but I was not affirmed by my parents, pediatrician, my peers. I was actually bullied for being gender non-conforming. And so, at the time, it was really difficult not being affirmed, but it caused me to wait until I was an adult. I was in my mid-20s when I transitioned. And although there are still some irreversible side effects that I'm dealing with after detransitioning, it's much less severe than if I had been affirmed at 13, if I had been on puberty blockers, et cetera, because then I could have lost my fertility, I could have bone fractures, and a bunch of other unpredictable health side effects that we don't even know about because, again, it's very experimental.
So I asked that question because I think for a lot of folks who are more libertarian-minded on either side of the aisle, one might say adults make decisions that they sometimes regret. Sometimes people get plastic surgery that they regret. There's obviously a lot of reporting right now about the trends away from the butt lifts that were very popular and are no longer popular. And I don't mean to conflate, obviously, this with what people go through when they transition. But they say, well, people make mistakes, but that's up for adults to do and decide on their own. And so the conversation has been very much focused on what to do about minors. But your own story doesn't seem to necessarily track with the concern here, given that you were not affirmed and didn't transition till you were an older adult. So I wonder how you see your own personal story as fitting in with the conversation about these laws that are coming down the pike and or have been enacted in Florida and are on the table in Tennessee.
So of the detransitioners who testified in Florida, I think there were maybe 10 or 11 of us altogether. And so far, just 2 of us had transitioned as minors. But I think the fact that so many people are transitioning as adults and regretting it and having irreversible effects that they have to deal with for the rest of their life. I think it just illustrates the fact that children definitely are too young to do this. They cannot consent to this. And furthermore, even adults who are transitioning, a lot of us are coming from a place of severe mental illness and distress. And so it was almost like we felt like we didn't have another choice and we weren't presented with any other options by the doctors. So just because someone's an adult, I don't necessarily think they're able to give informed consent if they are in a state of severe distress.
You've talked, I believe, previously about what you perceive to be the ease at which you were prescribed testosterone over the phone, I think. Can you speak about that?
Yes. So a lot of people tell me that this couldn't have happened, but actually, if you visit Planned Parenthood's website, they do claim that they do telehealth, and they also say that they prescribe hormones on the first appointment without a requirement for a letter from a mental health provider. So I did go through Planned Parenthood, and for me, it was about a 30-minute phone conversation before I was prescribed testosterone. And I do recall the doctor listing a few of the risks, but it was very brief, and I feel like it was largely downplayed to the point where I did not realize how experimental the care was. Like I thought the science was a lot stronger than it actually is.
Yeah. Well, according to the Online Health and Wellbeing Clinic, gender detransitioning is when a person who has already transitioned returns to their life as the gender they were assigned at birth. According to the most recent national survey in 2015, of nearly 28,000 people, 8% of respondents reported some kind of detransition. But of that 8%, 62% reported doing so only temporarily due to societal, financial, or family pressures. So I have a lot of sympathy. I mean, I've read your writing or talking interviews about how you're a singer and how you specifically requested a low dose of testosterone because you wanted to preserve your voice. You weren't sure what the effects were going to be on your voice, and that they in fact they prescribed you twice as much as they would normally have prescribed. I'm not sure if that was an error or what was happening there, but again, I have sympathy, on a human level for what you've gone through. I guess my question, my hesitation here is how much of this is a generalized medical malpractice issue. There are people who are overprescribed psychiatric medications and things like that. And how much of this is part of what seems to be a larger cultural project of raising up trans people and trans issues by conservatives in a way that doesn't seem to be as calculated to actually make the lives of people who are struggling with gender identity issues better. I mean, do you feel any of that dissonance?
Yes. So a lot of times I get called, a right-wing conservative, or that I just don't care what happens to trans people. I don't have any compassion for them. And it really couldn't be further from the truth. Like, I want people with trans identity who are struggling with gender dysphoria, like, I want the best possible care for them. And if I could, I just want to remark on that survey, because the survey from 2015, because the population that was being surveyed in that study was a population that still identifies as trans. And we know from other research, a study by Lisa Littman in 2021, and also another study by Ellie Vandenboos in 2021, that the vast majority of detransitioners no longer identify as trans. So that study by Jack Turbin, who's also being funded by one of the companies that manufactures puberty blockers, it leaves out the vast majority of detransitioners. So it's actually not an accurate reflection of how many people detransition. So that study gets cited a lot, but people tend to not cite as much the studies on detransitioners. But anyway, I'm just saying that because I would like to see the best quality of care for both trans-identified people and detransitioners. But as it stands right now, we need much better science, particularly about the long-term effects on physical and mental health.
Are you concerned about the effects? I mean, the rejoinder that people have is that even granting, the other study that you brought up, it does seem like the majority of people, like in the world we live in today, where there's so much cultural pressure, quite honestly, against being trans. Obviously, there's a great deal of stigma. I don't think most people wake up one day and say, I want to challenge myself by moving through the world in a way that I know that's going to get me a lot of social critique. Because that's the case, most people who do it because they really, really very strongly feel like this is a better outcome for them. This is how they feel compelled to live their lives. And I do understand that there are these cases of detransitioners, and those stories haven't always been given a platform and voiced equally in the public sphere. But I wonder if you're concerned at all about whether or not there is a trade-off that's happening where the majority of trans people who do want to transition and do want to be affirmed, even if it's to be called by the name of their choice and be allowed to wear the clothes of their choosing, are going to not be able to do so, and that has its own corresponding health and social wellness and mental health implications.
So again, I don't think we have, I mean, anecdotally, yes, many people say they are happy after transition, but I think the problem is that other options to treat gender dysphoria are not being researched. And also, you mentioned how difficult it is to be trans, and I don't deny that, but I think a lot of it has to do with culture's reaction to gender nonconforming people in general. Like, to put it simply, masculine women and feminine men, they tend to get treated like the bottom of the barrel in society. And a lot of the time, the reason why people want to transition is to escape that discomfort by then passing as the opposite sex. And so it's a complex issue. And I definitely don't want to prevent anyone from getting the best care that will lead to the best outcomes for mental health. But I just don't think we're looking at all options to treat gender dysphoria. And I also think we need to work as a broader society to accept people for how they are naturally, so that people don't feel forced to start hormones and get surgeries.
Well, Kat, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your experience. It's a very complicated issue, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
We'll have more Rising in just a minute.